So welcome to, as I said, class 3 of 4 for Buddhism in a nutshell. So just briefly, we're going to begin by looking at, again, the Four Noble Truths. This is really the foundation of the Buddha's teaching, and really everything that came after is really just a further explanation of one or more of the Four Noble Truths. So you have true suffering, true origin, true cessation, and true path. So, and by origin, cessation, and path, we mean origin of true suffering, cessation of true suffering, and path that leads to the cessation of true suffering. And you may have heard that formulated in different ways. Could be there is suffering, or sometimes life is suffering is one way, which isn't really a great, way of phrasing it. Sometimes you may have heard it, the truth of suffering, the truth of cessation, the truth of, or the truth of origin, the truth of cessation, and the truth of the path. But the phrasing true suffering, true origin, true cessation, and true path, I think is the clearest way of getting at what the Buddha is really saying. Because as ordinary sentient beings, we have our own ideas about what is suffering. And we have our own ideas about why we experience suffering. And we have our own ideas about what to do about that, whether or not it is removable, and if it is, to what extent, and what methods, what path we might use. So, noble, as we said in the first class, the Four Noble Truths. So we, as ordinary beings, have four ordinary truths, our own way of seeing the world. There are persons who have what's called a direct, non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality. When a person, through meditation, accomplishes that specific realization, they become a noble being, as opposed to an ordinary being like us. So a noble being sees the world differently. And these four truths are the way in which noble beings see the world. Their understanding of suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the methods that you might use to bring about that cessation are different than our understanding. And so that's what the Buddha taught. And then everything else that he taught was just a further elaboration of that. What is true suffering? What is its actual true origin? Can it be fully removed, the truth or the validity of its removal? And then what methods, what path, what practices, what realizations, what insights create that removal? And the good news is that the Buddha agrees with us that there is, that we do experience suffering, but his understanding of why we experience suffering is very detailed, very scientific, and it is ultimately something that we can rid ourselves of. We can follow in the footsteps of the Buddha and do as he did by tapping into our potential, the innate potential of our mind, to completely rid ourselves of even the subtlest levels of suffering, and achieve incredible heights of bliss and satisfaction and contentment, such that we even postulate are possible because of our deep habituation to what we take as inevitable, what we take as just kind of the baseline state. We don't have a lot of examples in our world of beings who've done this, and so we don't postulate it as possible. But the Buddha's direct observation, and everything that the Buddha taught comes from his direct observation. Buddhism is not a revealed teaching. It is the direct experience of the Buddha. And, there's evidence. You could say that over 2,600 years, any number of people have come after the Buddha and validated those experiences, those insights. His direct experience is that he came to understand the deepest, subtlest levels of suffering, and he came to understand what must be done to overcome them, and that it is not impossible that any sentient being like us, any ordinary sentient being, can follow in his footsteps and can get that same result. So that's a little bit about what the Buddha taught. And now we're going to today and tomorrow, today and next week, the next two classes, we're going to focus our attention on a text called The Foundation of All Good Qualities by Lama Tsongkhapa. Lama Tsongkhapa is the founder of the particular school of Tibetan Buddhism that we practice, that our center, Tupten Norbu Ling, practices. But we're going to backtrack from that a little bit and to say that that particular text is part of a genre, part of a literary effort to look at the sutra teachings, of which there are thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, and to condense the most sublime insights of the Buddha into a much more condensed, much easier to follow presentation that shows first do this, and then do this, and then do this. So it gives you a very clear roadmap, rather than just saying, here are thousands and thousands of pages of sutra material, and you're kind of on your own. What makes sense is to rely on great masters who did that work and provided these this roadmap, these practice manuals that are more recent. And by more recent, I mean, instead of 2,500 years old, they're 800, 1,000 years old. So, relatively recent as compared to the life of the Buddha, but these great masters have done that hard work and they've given us these texts. So this is called the lamrim, or the stages of the path to enlightenment. As I said, it takes a person, it takes a practitioner step by step. Do this, then do this, then do this. And by engaging in that path, one, as I mentioned, trains their mind and ultimately achieves what the Buddha achieved, this complete cessation of even the subtlest suffering, and this flourishing of potential of the mind. And this effort, this commentarial literary effort or genre, began with Lama Atisha. So that's where we're going to actually start. So Lama Atisha Dipankara, you can see his dates here, the dates of his birth and his passing. So again, it's a very recent tradition. Lama Atisha was the first person to try to present the teachings of the Buddha, which previously had just been in all of these sutras. We've all heard of the sutras of the Buddha, where the Buddha just traveled and he gave teachings to the various individuals and groups of people that he came across. So the Buddha never really intended to present a sort of one size fits all path. He taught to the audience that he was in front of. Just like if you were Neil deGrasse Tyson, and you were traveling the world giving lectures. Sometimes you would be invited to speak to an elementary school, sometimes to a high school, sometimes to a conference of the greatest minds in astrophysics. And you would tailor what you said to all of these different groups. Now, the difference is those are going to be recorded, in real time. And so people are going to see those on TV, and they're going to be able to say, okay, well, this was a high school, this was a college. And so they can kind of make sense of that. And it's also true that the Buddha's words were recorded. Eventually, they were written down. It was an oral tradition for hundreds of years, but eventually the words of the Buddha were written down. He was followed around by very highly realized practitioners who had perfect recall. And so they could remember what he said, but eventually it got written down. But it was passed from generation to generation through this oral tradition. But it's much harder for us to get a sense of the level of his audience. So what we're kind of left with is sometimes the Buddha would explain a given topic to a certain level of depth. Other times it would be to a greater level of depth. And that can seem contradictory when you just have those words that make it look like sometimes he said this, sometimes he said that. So that makes the study of the sutras very difficult. But as I said, these extraordinary masters like Lama Atisha, like Lama Tsongkhapa, they had the ability to make sense of that. They did the hard work of saying, well, when the Buddha said this, it was an interpretable teaching given to a group of persons who were not ready or able to put into practice a more subtle or sophisticated presentation of that topic. At another time, he came across people who were prepared to engage with a subtler, more sophisticated presentation. So the lamrim extracts the real essence, the real meaning of the sutras, and provides us with this really condensed, very easy to follow way of engaging with the Buddhist teachings. And as I said, the first person to try this was Lama Atisha, who wrote Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. That's the first lamrim text that we have. Okay. But as I also mentioned, we're actually going to be using Lama Tsongkhapa's Foundation of All Good Qualities, which is also a lamrim text. There are a number of different lamrim texts that are all part of this commentarial effort. They vary in length. Ultimately, if a person really wants to understand the lamrim, they do have to read lamrim texts that provide a lot of supporting argumentation, that go into a good deal of depth. These books, you could say, are hundreds of pages long. In some cases, even approaching, almost 1,000 pages in length, with all of the citations and so on. Still, though, compared to the several thousand, the multiple thousands of pages of sutra, not all of which are in what seems like agreement in the points, it's still much easier to follow. The Foundation of All Good Qualities is what's called a lamrim prayer. It's a very, very short, it's just a couple of pages. So it doesn't actually explain these topics in any detail. It's kind of meant to be memorized. It's also called a glance meditation on the lamrim. People memorize the Foundation of All Good Qualities and they recite it every day to kind of go through the whole path in their mind. But you do ultimately need to study longer texts that actually give you the supporting details. But we are going to fill in some of those details as we go through, but just not in the same exact way as you would if you studied, a text that was a few hundred pages long. Now, I will say that the lamrim, it's a relatively formal approach to the study of Tibetan Buddhism. If a person is brand new to Tibetan Buddhism, maybe the first couple of things that you might read might be a little bit more general, books by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and so on. If you feel like you want to read a lamrim text, then the one I recommend starting with is is Yangtze Rinpoche's Practicing the Path. It's a modern commentary on another text by Lama Tsongkhapa, which is the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path. The Great Treatise is a 3-volume work, but Yangtze Rinpoche's book is just a single book. So, I would say if you haven't really read it all, to just read some of His Holiness's works, and then maybe read Yangtze Rinpoche's Practicing the Path. Okay, so again, then these are Lama Tsongkhapa's dates. So you can see that Lama Tsongkhapa was a couple of hundred years after Lama Atisha, so even more recent. And as I mentioned, he wrote the text that we'll be using, which is The Foundation of All Good Qualities. He also wrote the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path, which is really the seminal lamrim text in our tradition. But as I mentioned, it's a 3-volume work. It's quite readable. It's written in a very conversational style for the most part, but it does have a lot of citations, a lot of supporting evidence. So I'll cover just one more point and then I'll pause for questions. So the lamrim, in general, any lamrim text is going to be divided up into 3 scopes. So as I mentioned, it's called the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment. And the idea is that you progress from one topic to the next, and so on. So the topics build from the first to the last. And as a whole, they're organized into 3 scopes: the small scope, the middling scope, and the great scope. And these 3 scopes differ on the intent or the motivation of the practitioner. So a small scope practitioner is someone who is concerned about, we've talked about how the Buddha is in agreement with us that unsatisfactory conditions abound in our experience, that suffering is something that as ordinary sentient beings, we come up against again and again and again. There are types of suffering that are the most intense that sentient beings can experience. And there are types of rebirth where that's happening. In Buddhism, we call those the lower realms, meaning that the mind, we've talked in the previous classes about the mind, how the mind and the body are different phenomena, and the mind is associating with form. It did that at the first moment of the coming together of this body in the womb for us in this life, but the mind existed before the coming together of this body in this life, and the mind will exist after the death of this physical form, the death of this body. So mind is associating with forms. That's what mind does if you're an ordinary sentient being. Some of those forms, like forms in the animal realm, are experiencing more suffering than we experience. Animals, for a variety of reasons, they have a worse kind of time than almost any human. And then there are other kinds of realms as well, where it's even, the suffering is even generally more intense. And so a practitioner of the small scope is someone who is learning about that, is understanding that, and understandably becomes motivated to avoid that kind of suffering. And that's a practitioner of the small scope. Their goal is to engage with the Buddha's teachings such that they are successful in avoiding the worst kinds of suffering that are possible. There's also then, though, the middle scope. And a practitioner of the middle scope is someone who understands suffering even more deeply, even to a deeper, subtler level than a practitioner on the small scope. So we, as you know, or I could say people who practice Tibetan Buddhism begin with the teachings that are on the small scope. You don't skip that. You start with that, and you're presented with the things that the Buddha taught that help you to understand this kind of intense suffering and how to avoid that kind of intense suffering. What kinds of meditative realizations have to be cultivated, what kinds of changes are necessary to avoid giving rise to the causes and the conditions that would allow our mind to associate with the forms that are experiencing the most intense kinds of sufferings. That same practitioner, though, after they do that, they can mature in their perspective, and they can come to understand that, yes, there are these specific types of beings who are experiencing the worst kinds of suffering that are possible. But also, we as humans are not out of the woods with regard to this whole idea of suffering. The human realm is not one of the lower realms. It's not where these worst kinds of sufferings are being experienced. And yet, it's no picnic being in the human realm. There's disease, there's loss of loved ones, there's, war, there's crushing poverty, there's all kinds of, pretty intense sufferings that are occurring in that. And there are even actually beings or forms that have less suffering, even in the human realm, that are also possible for mind to associate with. And yet, even in those realms, it's not perfect. Those realms are still temporary. You have individual lifetimes within them, and then the mind moves to yet another kind of form. So a practitioner on this middling scope is someone who understands suffering to this deeper, subtler level. And they come to the realization that they don't wish to experience even those subtler sufferings. They want to put an end to suffering entirely. And so that's the middling scope. And a person, let's say, again, a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, they begin to engage with the small scope and they really become an expert in the small scope. And then they would graduate to the middle scope. and they would really become an expert in all of those teachings, all of that wisdom. And they would then develop a real, what's called renunciation. Um, in both of these scopes, there is renunciation happening. Renunciation isn't the best English word from from my perspective, but it is the most common English word that's used. The Tibetan, the sort of direct English transliteration of the Tibetan is definite emergence, which is better, or the wish to definitely emerge from suffering, right? So on the small scope, we renounce, we give up the things that we might otherwise be doing that might create the causes and the conditions to experience those worst kinds of suffering, for example. And so understanding karma, which is something we talked a little bit about before, and we'll talk in more detail on, plays a big role in understanding what kinds of familiarities, what kinds of energy in the mind gives rise to certain kinds of experiences in the future. So, for example, murdering people is a very heavy negative karma. It creates a very dark, heavy, negative energy in the mind, which that familiarity, that energy will remain imprinted in the mind, and at some point in the future, when the causes and the conditions are right, then that mind will experience a very suffering, heavy, negative result. So a practitioner on the small scope is going to give up murdering people as one example, right? They may at some point like really become angry, but they will remind themselves of the disadvantages of that kind of action, that kind of behavior, because it leads to the worst kinds of suffering. So that's a kind of renunciation. There might be things that we might otherwise want to do that we are going to hold ourselves back from. We're going to restrain our actions so that we don't create the causes to experience those worst kinds of suffering. But on the middle scope, we're just deepening that idea. We are trying to think about the fact that even if we don't create those causes, we're still creating causes to experience even these better forms, these better realms. And these better realms are not completely free of suffering. So we really develop a real weariness with the whole process of just being an unenlightened, ordinary sentient being. And for a Theravada practitioner, we've talked a little bit about in previous classes that there's Mahayana and Theravada. Theravada is what predominates in the Southeast Asian countries. For that practitioner, they use this weariness to extricate themselves from cyclic existence, which is this process of rebirth. It's called cyclic existence, and it's called cyclic because there's a finite number of options, and your mind can only kind of cycle between them. Sometimes it's experiencing a form where there's relatively less suffering. Sometimes it's experiencing a form where there's relatively more suffering, but it's kind of cycling between the various options that are finite. So a Theravadan practitioner would use this middle scope to extricate themselves using the Buddha's wisdom and methods from experiencing this cyclic existence. A Tibetan Buddhist practitioner is a Mahayana practitioner. So they use the middle scope to develop this weariness, this renunciation of creating the causes of even the better options within ordinary cyclic existence. However, they don't then just extricate themselves from that. They progress to the great scope. The great scope is unique to the Mahayana tradition. So when a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner is trying to master the small scope or the middling scope, the way that they describe that is they're engaging with the practices that are held in common with practitioners of the small scope and of the middling scope. They don't think of themselves as practitioners of the small scope or practitioners of the middling scope, but they engage with the practices that are held in common with practitioners of the small scope and the middling scope, because the goal is to progress to the great scope. So a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner develops this real weariness of cyclic existence as a whole. They don't want, they are just wanting to get to the great scope and actually become a fully enlightened Buddha, uh, which is, again, unique to the Mahayana tradition. So on the great scope, you have this real weariness of all forms of suffering, and you are now really motivated to achieve enlightenment, because enlightenment is completely free of all suffering, and it's the complete flourishing of all of the positive potential that we possess. And again, it's just something that the Buddha came to understand was possible. Enlightenment is a state that our mind can develop, and reality simply permits mind or consciousness to accomplish that. It also permits us to remain as an ordinary sentient being. Reality is agnostic about which of those we do. We can remain as an ordinary sentient being, or we can develop the mind in the way that the Buddha developed the mind and accomplish that particular result. It's a lot like chess. Chess is a body of knowledge that how to play chess is a body of knowledge that exists in our world. People came up with it. I mean, the difference is that it's completely made up, and the Buddha only noticed, but still, it's a body of knowledge. You could say maybe cooking, because cooking has a relationship to the laws of physics, heat and cold, and so on. So you could say, over the millennia, people learned this is the best temperature, this is the best, method. You first, you combine the ingredients in this way. You don't add this before you add this if you want to learn how to bake cakes. But whether you want to learn how to bake cakes is entirely up to you. Nobody cares if you choose to become a baker or not. And in the same way, we can choose to become fully enlightened or not. But a practitioner on the great scope is engaging with the Buddha's wisdom specifically for how do I become fully enlightened, on the basis of all of my knowledge of suffering and not wanting any of that suffering. But critically, the difference is also the reason that a person would go further than the middle scope. The reason that a person would go further than simply just extricating themselves is because they realize that everyone else is ordinary, and everyone else, and by everyone, I don't just mean humans, I mean sentient beings, mind possessors, like we said before. So all of the different realms, all of these different forms that where mind and form are together, they're all experiencing these sufferings again and again and again. And an enlightened being can do something about that. An enlightened being can enter into ordinary cyclic existence and try to work for the benefit of these ordinary sentient beings. Whereas a person who extricate themselves on the middle scope, they become what's called an arhat. And they have accomplished their own welfare. They no longer suffer, but they lack the ability to enter back into cyclic existence. So it's not only motivated by understanding suffering for oneself, but particularly understanding suffering for all other sentient beings. So motivated by this wish to be of benefit to these sentient beings is the reason that a person progresses from the middling scope to the great scope. Okay, so that's how the lamrim, the stages of the path to enlightenment, are organized. They're organized in accordance with the motivation of the practitioner who is practicing them. And Tibetan Buddhist practitioners aspire to the great scope. They aspire to become practitioners of the great scope. And they do that by mastering the small scope and then mastering the middle scope and then ultimately mastering the great scope. So I will pause. As I said, any thoughts or questions so far?
I don't have anything. Thank you.
Nothing for me right now. I do appreciate the examples provided in this section. It's helpful to better understand it.
Okay. So now, as I said, we're going to start using Lama Tsongkhapa's Foundation of All Good Qualities, but we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits of the lamrim or the useful features. So there are four what are said to be the four features of the stages of the path to enlightenment. So again, these are four benefits that accrue by engaging with the teachings in this way. So as I mentioned, the sutras can look contradictory, but by studying the lamrim, we see that some of the people that the Buddha came across were practitioners of the small scope. Some of them were practitioners of the middle scope, and some of them were practitioners of the great scope. And so he gave teachings that were in accordance with the level of the students that he came across. It wouldn't have made, just like you wouldn't want Neil deGrasse Tyson to go into an elementary school and start talking about, quantum foam and all kinds of, crazy things that they wouldn't have any capacity to understand. The Buddha also didn't do that. And by understanding this, we make sense of the sutras. Okay. And in the same way, we come to see that everything that the Buddha taught is meant to be understood as personal advice, that nothing that he said was just sort of an interesting factoid. He never just kind of threw out information just for the sake of knowledge. Everything is geared toward helping us to understand suffering deeply, to be motivated to overcome suffering, to develop the qualities of a person who is able to ripen their mind and progress through these stages. So there's nothing that we shouldn't ever look at anything that the Buddha says and just say, oh, that's interesting, but I wonder what I should practice. Everything that the Buddha said is personal advice, is meant for our own practice, because we can see that right now we're not practitioners of even the small scope. We haven't fully given up the, not so great karmas, the not so great impulses that exist in the mind that can give rise to that suffering. We're really pretty focused on just this life. We're not so focused on the overall spiritual trajectory. So everything that the Buddha taught is meant to cultivate our mind in a very, very logical way through the stages. And so we should try to take everything that we read and think, well, how do I integrate this? What does this mean for my life and my practice? How do I use this to develop my own mind? Okay. The next is the threefold path. So this is another feature of the lamrim. We've talked about one of this. There's two meanings to the threefold path. We've talked about one of them, which is that the path is organized into small scope, middle scope, and great scope, the three scopes. There's another way of understanding the threefold path, which is what is cultivated on the path. This is also called the three principal aspects of the path. So this is renunciation, which we have talked about, and then bodhicitta, which we haven't really talked about. Bodhicitta is a compound word. Bodhi means awakening, and citta means mind. So the mind of awakening, which doesn't really tell you what it means, but it means the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So that's another principal aspect of the entire path. So as we said, really on the first two scopes, really it's renunciation that you're cultivating. And again, definite emergence isn't that, because renunciation has this sort of 14th century like European sort of self-flagellating aspect, and that's not a really good way of thinking. It has a lot of baggage. But when we think, I wish to definitely emerge from suffering, I wish to just definitely put an end to suffering, which means I have to turn away from creating the cause of suffering. I have to turn away from the actions of body, speech, and mind that are generating my suffering. So there is an aspect of not doing certain things, but we all have that. We all find it quite easy, as I think, the example that I've used before, we all probably find it quite easy not to do really, really hard drugs, heroin, methamphetamines, because we see that as suffering. We recognize that, yeah, maybe there's some moments of pleasure there, or people wouldn't do it, but you lose your job, you lose your house, your health quickly deteriorates. It's not worth it, is the goal, is the takeaway. And so really in the same way, we might want to steal something, we might want to lie to somebody, we might want to but from the Buddhist perspective, it's not worth it because it creates the cause of future suffering. So in the moment, maybe we can say, well, yeah, if I stole this candy bar or whatever, I'd get to eat a candy bar that I wouldn't otherwise get to eat. But it's not worth it because it's going to create a familiarity in my mind. It's going to set me down a path that's going to lead to my suffering, and I don't want suffering. And so it's just sort of a deeper way of something that really we're already familiar with. So that's renunciation, or the wish to definitely emerge from suffering. And then bodhicitta, the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And those are the three principal aspects of the path, which is the other way of understanding the threefold path. It's another feature of studying the lamrim. And and then the third is what's called right view, which is something that we'll talk about next week. As I mentioned, this idea of seeing the nature of reality directly, that's right view. And that's something that we cultivate on the great scope. So the first of these, renunciation, we cultivate on the small scope and the middling scope, on the great scope is really where we cultivate bodhicitta and we cultivate correct view, which is how to see the nature of reality directly, which we will talk about next week. Okay. And then this feature, the teachings are protected from the fault of abandoning the Dharma. And so this means that we might, if we didn't study the lamrim, we might hear these teachings on bodhicitta, we might hear these teachings on, developing this lofty goal of achieving enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And we might think, oh, well, I don't need the small scope. I don't need the middle scope. I'm just going to practice the great scope. But when we understand how the three scopes are all part of the training for a single individual, that's the key takeaway, that it isn't that it's true that the Buddha came across people who were only ready to hear the small scope, or they were only ready to hear the middle scope. But ultimately, the Buddha intended all people to progress through all of the scopes. So the lamrim is meant as a continuous path of training for a single individual. So we can't denigrate the small scope. We can't denigrate the middle scope. They play an indispensable role in preparing our own mind for the great scope. So it would be a mistake to abandon or ignore or denigrate any part of what the Buddha taught, because it's all part of one continuous path of training. Okay, so those are the four features of the lamrim, and now we're ready to go into the lamrim itself. Any thoughts or questions before we do that?
I'm good, thank you.
I'm good too. Thank you.
So, as I said, the small scope is meant to create a training in our minds such that we close the door to the lower realms, that by mastering the small scope, we no longer create the causes and the conditions to give rise to taking rebirth in the lower realms. That's the point of the small scope. And it's, something, again, that we can't just skip over. We do actually have to master that. Okay, so this is verse 1 of the foundation of all good qualities. And as I said, this is a lamrim prayer or a glance meditation. So these verses themselves don't go into any detail. So we'll be supplying that detail. But if you were to study, let's say, Practicing the Path by Yangtze Rinpoche, there'd be a whole chapter on each of these verses that would go into detail. Okay, so the foundation of all good qualities is the kind and venerable Guru. Correct devotion to him is the root of the path. By clearly seeing this and applying great effort, please bless me to rely upon him with great respect. Okay, so there's, in a way, two things to understand. Really, we could put this slide before characterizing this section as freedom from the lower realms. This is verse 1 of the foundation of all good qualities. But when you look at other lamrim texts, they will put this topic kind of before the section of the insights or the tools that actually close the door to the lower realm specifically. And the reason they do that is because this topic applies equally to all of the scopes. It is, as it says here, the foundation of all good qualities. So it's the foundation of everything that we develop on the small scope and the middle scope and the great scope. So it's different in that sense than the specific insights that apply to just the small scope. So yeah, just to maybe say that. And of course, it does say the word him is here. This text was written, as I said, hundreds of years ago, 700-800 years ago. So that is a very sort of cultural phenomenon. The fact that at the time that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote this, it is a fact that there were very, very, very few female Buddhist teachers, gurus. That's just a fact of the time and place hundreds of years ago when Lama Tsongkhapa was alive and wrote this text. Today, that's not true. Today, there are many highly qualified female Buddhist teachers. And so a person's teacher could be male or female. There's such a reverence for the primary source material that they won't kind of update them to be more, in line with what's true now. So we do study it as it was written at the time. But the takeaway here is that in Tibetan Buddhism, there is an emphasis that is placed on a student's relationship with a person that they take as their guide, their teacher, their guru, the person that is helping them to understand this material, to, clarify their doubts, to, as a sounding board, as a source of wisdom, someone who's guiding and shepherding them, a person who has gone through this path and understands it and is helping the student to navigate the path, this personal relationship. It's also true that this isn't something that we ought to rush into trying to, and it's a little bit challenging in the sense that we're presented, when we study Tibetan Buddhism, we're presented with this kind of statement, and we kind of panic. We kind of think, oh, well, if I don't have a guru, then everything is hopeless. And that's just not true. We can certainly, for a time, we can certainly, and we should kind of study on our own, for a time, because it's quite serious to enter into a teacher-student relationship. It's a very personal, very serious thing where we're saying, I'm choosing this person to be my guide through my spiritual development. So we need to take time and learn kind of the basics on our own, because really we have to understand who is a valid teacher. Who should I pick? Who's right to be able to entrust with my spiritual development? Because if that goes wrong and we're led by someone who's not qualified, then it's really disastrous. And it takes time for us to be able to get our own qualities such that we can check who is or isn't a valid teacher. So we really need to, go slowly and not rush into and think, well, I just have to devote myself to a teacher. And it's also a difficult topic because it's a foreign concept to the Western mind. It's sort of this idea of like an apprenticeship, where we're coming under the tutelage of someone. We are, in a way, recognizing that we haven't mastered this path, but there are people who have, and they can show us how to do that, which means kind of subjugating our own views to the views of this other person, in the same way that you would if you wanted to learn any kind of skill, that you don't have. If you wanted to learn how to make shoes, you would apprentice yourself to a master shoemaker. And you wouldn't argue with that person. You wouldn't say, well, no, that's not how you make shoes. You wouldn't say, well, that's dumb. Why are you doing it like that? Because you know nothing about how to make shoes, and you trust that this person is an expert in this. And so you would just go along, for the most part. You would ask, if you were confused, you would ask for clarification. If you thought something seemed off, you would try to check your understanding. But you wouldn't have like a combative, egotistical sort of war with this person, because you understand that they know what they're talking about and you would like to do what they can do. So there is this kind of coming under the influence of a guru. And that's a very non-Western kind of way of thinking. So it's very difficult for the Western mind. So again, definitely not something to rush into, and not something to feel like, if I can't do this from day one, that all is lost and that this is hopeless. It's very valid and really pretty necessary to spend time kind of getting the basics, just kind of on our own. And that doesn't mean that we don't go to teachings and we don't seek out teachers. There's a big difference between going to a teaching and listening to the information versus regarding that person as one's own guru, one's own teacher. That's very different. So certainly we can seek out teachings without having to think about that person is who I'm entrusting to be my guru. So this is very much about finding the person that you are choosing to entrust with your spiritual growth and development, and then creating a very personal relationship with that person. And a person can also have more than one guru over time. They can have maybe what's called a root guru, then they can have sort of secondary teachers and so on. That's certainly the case. But it is fair to say that Tibetan Buddhism carves out a special place for that kind of relationship, because if we never develop it, if we never come under that kind of relationship, we will be limited. There is only so much that we can learn from books, from kind of keeping a distance from people. We will hit a wall at a certain point, and that's the time to find a guru, when you feel like, okay, I've kind of taken this as far as I can go, and now it's time to find a guru. But not from day one, even though this is, of course, the foundation of all good qualities, because it's also true that we are learning from valid sources. We are learning from people like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, from people like Lama Tsongkhapa. We're learning from valid teachers. And so in that way, we're not just making it up. We are turning toward really valid sources of information. And, we're also looking toward older students and teachers that we're not regarding as our guru. So, we do have tools that we are using. We're just kind of not rushing into this specific kind of relationship. Okay. So I know, I mean, it's a huge topic, and as I say, if there's whole chapter that are devoted to this when you study this in more detail. But questions, thoughts?
Personally, I know I'm not ready to, select or a guru, but if I ever get to that point of readiness, which I hope I do in my lifetime, how do you form a relationship with someone, whether it be a monk, a nun, a yama, etc., when there really isn't any, but like at my center right now, we don't have a resident
Mhm.
teacher. I mean, how do you even, I mean, do you have, like, can you check in with somebody over Zoom every once in a while? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, the benefit is that we do have these technological, means of keeping in closer contact with people who aren't necessarily, physically close to us all of the time. So, you would want to study with that person for, as I said, you really want to check their qualities. You want to make sure that you're making a good choice. So that involves for a period of time. And it really could even be years, where you're taking teachings from that person just as a teacher and not your guru. Um, and then you would, when you had that high degree of confidence, when you really felt like you've studied, what makes a good teacher and am I ready and so on, then you go to them and you say, I would like you to be my teacher, and then they can say yes or they can say no. They can say, well, you know, do these things, study these things and come back to me and, see then, because they're kind of checking, are you going to do what they say? Are you willing to, they might say you need to do a certain number of practices, you know, and then you would come back to them and tell them how it went. And then they might say, okay, well, okay, this they're listening to me. There's someone that I can work with. And then they might agree. But yeah, there's email, there's Zoom, there's airplanes, so we do have these means of periodically checking in, with a person's teacher.
Thank you.
Okay. So verse 2. Okay. Understanding that the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once is greatly meaningful and is difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly day and night takes its essence. So there's a lot of concepts here in verse 2. And this is really where we begin to go into the wisdom that teaches us how to close the door to the lower realms in, specifically. Okay, so the first concept here is this idea of the precious freedom of this rebirth. And well, so yeah, so the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once, is greatly meaningful, and is difficult to find again. Those are related concepts that are all part of the general concept of what's called precious human rebirth. So we know that we presently have a human rebirth. This form that our mind has associated with is a human form. From the Buddhist perspective, there's a subdivision of being human, which is to not only be human, but to actually possess a precious human rebirth, which means a human that is in possession of 18 specific qualities. There are humans who lack one or more of the 18 qualities of a precious human rebirth. So they have a human rebirth, but not a quote unquote precious human rebirth. And a precious human rebirth is one in which it is easier to practice Buddhism, practice these stages, practice the Buddha's wisdom, than it would be if you just had an ordinary human rebirth. So we'll look at these 18 qualities, and that'll become a bit more clear. Okay, So these are organized, as I said, there's 18 of them. They're organized into the freedoms and the endowments. The freedoms are negative things that could characterize our life, but don't. So negative things that we are free from. And the first four of those are basically not having been born in any of the other realms. So I alluded to the lower realms and the upper realms previously. The lower realms are listed here: the animal realm, the spirit realm, and the hell realm. Hell is, again, another one of these English translations that aren't great, because of all of the baggage that comes with that. It's the word Narok, which means the state of being unfree. It is a realm in which there's a great deal of physical and mental distress. So it's interestingly not unlike the Christian conception of hell, in terms of the in terms of the fact that it is an experience where there's a lot of torment, there's a lot of unpleasantness happening. The difference, so culture, it's interesting that different cultures kind of all came up with the same idea in various ways. Maybe there were glimpses in meditation, because almost all of the other religious traditions have esoteric aspects, have meditators, within them. So it could be that all of these traditions had individuals who had glimpses of that kind of experience, and it got carried into all of these different religious traditions. I think that's possible. The difference, though, is that it's temporary. From the Christian perspective, you go to hell and that's it. From the Buddhist perspective, you take a rebirth in hell, and again, it's the Narok realm, the state of being unfree, and then that ends, at a particular time. It doesn't go on forever and ever. And then there's the spirit realm, also sometimes called the hungry ghost realm, which is another. It's Preta is the Tibetan, and translated into English as hungry ghost. Again, it's another kind of form where also quite unpleasant. The sufferings of hunger and thirst predominate in that realm. There's kind of this insatiable hunger and thirst. And so that's, we all know that being hungry and thirsty is unpleasant. So just imagine never really being able to do anything about it is kind of the experience of the Preto realm. It's this hunger and thirst that just is continuous. And it's a manifestation, again, of certain energies that come about through certain karmic causes and conditions. And then there's the animal realm. We mentioned before how humans are not considered animals from the Buddhist perspective because humans have a very different experience than animals have. Biologically, in the West, we say that humans are animals. But from the Buddhist perspective, the kind of experience is very different. So humans are a different realm. The animal realm is anything from a mosquito up to, a whale, anything like that. That's all the animal realm. And then there's the upper realm, the celestial realm. And these realms are, there's comparatively less suffering in these realms. But again, they're temporary, and so they're not advantageous from the Buddhist perspective. They're not something to aim for because they are still part of ordinary cyclic existence. And so we're free from all of these forms have disadvantages, and we're not experiencing any of those disadvantages at present, which is quite good. So that's part of the free. I know all kinds of problems just happened. Okay, so we'll carry on. Okay, so we could have taken a human rebirth at a time and place where a Buddha has not taught, or where the teachings of the Buddha, the Dharma, do not exist, or we could have what are called defective sense powers, or we could be having what are called wrong views. So these are also further freedoms. So of course, if had we been born 2,700 years ago, no Buddha would have appeared in our world, which means that the Dharma, the teachings wouldn't exist, which means we couldn't practice the teachings. Also, even in our world right now, there are most likely places where the teachings are suppressed, where due to the regime that's in power, certain access is constrained, very limited, and so people don't really have the freedom to engage in that, even though the Buddha did appear in that world. So, but for us in America, at least, right now, we have access, freedom of religion, we can study things, it's easy to engage in that. And so we benefit from a time and a place where the Buddha has taught and where the teachings continue to exist. Also, though, in the future, in thousands of years, it could be that the teachings completely disappear from the world, just like the teachings of ancient Egyptian religions aren't really well understood anymore. They're not really practiced. In a few thousand years, that could be what Buddhism is like on the earth. So that would be a disadvantage, and we're free from that. Defective sense powers is, in a way, another one of these sort of cultural, teachings to some degree. Of course, 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, if a person was blind, if they were deaf, etc., it'd be almost impossible for them to engage with the teachings. And that's not really true anymore. There could still be some disadvantages in terms of the way that certain imprints come into the mind through the visual sense or through the auditory sense, that that could, so I can't say that there's no consequence to that anymore, but I think a lot of those consequences have been ameliorated by technology. But it is true that at least it could be to some degree an obstacle. It's not making things as easy as it would otherwise be, and I think that obstacle was likely greater, in the past than it is now. And then wrong views is interesting. It's wrong views is understood to be holding very strongly to a philosophical perspective that would prohibit a person from developing any interest in the teachings. So, if a person just isn't willing to look at the Buddhist teachings because they're holding a different philosophical perspective that they think is contradictory, and therefore they're saying like, no, this is heresy, this is witchcraft, this is awful, I won't look at it because I hold other philosophical views. That's, from the Buddhist perspective, that is going to prevent that person, at least in that lifetime, from, of course, achieving enlightenment, because enlightenment is a very specific thing that the Buddha taught, and it doesn't exist in other philosophical systems. Now, that doesn't mean that a person who holds other views is doing anything wrong. I mean, it does say wrong views. So from the perspective of Buddhism, those ideas are not accurate, because the Buddha's observation, for example, about karma isn't something that the Buddha invented. Karma is something that the Buddha observed. So if a person denies that karma exists and they're not willing to look at it, then from the Buddhist perspective, it's kind of like saying, well, gravity doesn't exist. Like, from the Buddhist perspective, karma exists independent of whether or not you choose to believe it. In the same way that electromagnetism or gravity or what have you exists independent upon your willingness to believe it. So, I mean, yeah, that's a very kind of Buddhist, understanding of things. But of course, it's absolutely the case that if a person is holding to a different religious view, that might be the best vehicle for them to make spiritual progress. We ought not go out and try to convince people that they are holding wrong views. That's not the idea. For them in this lifetime, that might be the perfect vehicle for making spiritual progress. But it's also true that they're not engaging with the specific wisdom or insights that could cause them to become fully enlightened in that lifetime. They can't do that because they maybe, they're holding different philosophical views. So it's a difficult kind of subject, but that's the idea. Any questions about the freedoms? Okay, so then we'll go on to the endowments, and these are positive, beneficial things that do in fact characterize our experience. And some of these we'll see are just the opposite of the negative things. So there are what are called the circumstantial endowments, or you could say the environmental endowments, and then the personal endowments. Circumstantial refer to things outside of oneself, and personal, of course, refer to things inside of oneself. So we'll start with the circumstantial endowments. Okay, so, and again, these are the opposite of the negativities, or the negative things that we're free from. So positively, we do in fact live in a world where the Buddha has come, the Buddha has also taught, the teachings also continue to exist. There are followers of the teachings, meaning that, it isn't just small pockets of Buddhism here and there. There are many valid teachers. It's widely understood. We can easily find people to help us understand more deeply. And there are favorable conditions, meaning that there are places of learning, there are places where we can do retreat, there are monasteries, there are nunneries, there are centers, and there are people who value those places. There are people who will support the establishment of monasteries and nunneries and places of learning. So there's a kind of baseline level of support in the world for all of the favorable conditions. And then there are personal, so all of those refer to circumstances outside of ourselves. And we have the personal endowments, which are being born in what's called a central land, which again is really just a place where the teachings are easily accessible. We have intact sense faculties. We've not committed one of the 5 heinous actions. The 5 heinous actions are also called the 5 actions of immediate retribution. And retribution is not, neither of these words are great. Heinous and retribution, they're both problematic in different ways. But it just means that it's understood as we've said, when a person engages in an action, they create a karma. They create a karmic seed, and that karmic seed ripens as experience in the future. And most of the time, that karmic seed can just sort of ripen when the causes and the conditions come together at some point down the line. And we don't really know anything more than to say at some point, the causes and the conditions will ripen that karma. There are some actions that are so heavily negative that it's understood that if you engage in them, then that karma will ripen at the death of that particular lifetime. It's not going to ripen in the future. It's going to ripen immediately. And by immediately means when you die, and you will be thrown then into the lower realms immediately. Those 5 actions are to take the life of one's parent, one's mother, one's father, to take the life of an arhat. Again, an arhat is someone who has seen the nature of reality directly on the Theravadan path. They could be someone who's done that on the Bodhisattva path. It could be an Arya Bodhisattva, but someone who has seen the nature of reality directly to take that person's life, because they are an exalted kind of being. They're a very powerful karmic object due to that realization. And so to kill them is quite negative. To do what's called maliciously wound a fully enlightened being. Fully enlightened beings are said to be very difficult to kill because they are omniscient. They know what you're going to do. With weapons of mass destruction now, I don't know how that might change things. But maybe, you could destroy the whole world, I suppose, through nuclear weapons, and, but maybe they would kind of separate their mind from their body prior to doing that, and just kind of they'd get out of the way in a more dramatic fashion than they could in the past. I don't know. But historically speaking, they're understood to be very difficult to kill, being omniscient. But there's a story where someone tried to kill Buddha Shakyamuni. He caused a very large boulder to roll down a hill, and it smashed into thousands and thousands of shards. And the Buddha, being omniscient, was able to kind of get out of the way of just about all of that. But there was one very small shard that drew a very thin line of blood, because, the Buddha was physically there, and, so it was this kind of massive cloud of shards of rock. And that was sort of the best that this person who tried to kill the Buddha could do. So that was maliciously wounding the Buddha. So we don't want to maliciously wound a Buddha, but we don't know who is or isn't a Buddha, so we should really try not to maliciously wound anyone, because you never know if they're a Buddha or not. So to kill one's mother, to kill one's father, to kill an arhat, to maliciously wound a Buddha, or to create what's called a schism in the Sangha. Sangha is a community of ordained monks and nuns, monks or nuns, or maybe both. Usually monasteries and nunneries are separate places. So you go into a well-functioning monastery or nunnery, and you kind of cause division, you sow division, you cause that to no longer be a well-functioning religious harmonious community. That's to create a schism in the Sangha. It's a very, very negative karma, because those are people who are striving for enlightenment. They have this lofty goal, trying to be of benefit, and you go in there and you kind of wreak havoc intentionally. Of course, would have to be the understanding, and very, very powerfully negative karma to do something like that. So there's all kinds of negative karma, but these 5, they don't ripen at some point in the future, they ripen at death. So hopefully we've not done any of those in this life, and so we're free. We're endowed with not having done that. Okay, so that's going to be all that we have time to cover today. Any thoughts or questions?
I'm good, thank you.
I will definitely go back and watch the first 2 in the series to catch up a little bit more on the knowledge.
All righty, so we'll finish up next week, the last class. And all right, so if there are any questions, we can address those. But otherwise, we'll come back next week and finish up.
Okay, thank you, Venerable.
Righty.
Thank you.
Evening.
Have a good weekend.
Thank
You
you.
too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.